Hello and welcome to the Black Ponder. I'm Neil Trotter. Today we're going to be talking about some more feminism. That's right, we're going to specifically be talking about feminist theory, which is, feminism within a philosophical context. And we're going to do that via this book right here, Discussion, this classic of second wave feminism, The Feminine Mystique by Betty Friedan. So this book right here, a very important book for sure. It is criticized because the argument is that it's a bit dated. And this is a work of second wave feminism, so it doesn't have a lot of what third wave feminism would bring later on, which is the issue of race, right? And it also doesn't really address the queer identity that much. This book was published in 1963. First published in 1963, which is during the Civil Rights Movement. So it is a bit strange that there's no real meaningful discussion of race and the Civil Rights Movement in that regard. However, this book does have some very important discussions. It has some very important topics that are unfortunately very applicable to today. And I'll tell you, 2019, people can still learn a lot from this book. They can learn a lot. And this isn't just like a history lesson on feminism. It's also a book that you can read where you can learn a lot about why feminism is important, even today. And there's things that are discussed in this book that we can apply today that will make this world a better place. So that's what we're going to talk about today. And how we do that is we read quotes. Black Ponder, that's what we do here. So I'm going to just get started with the first quote and then we'll talk about it. We'll add some supplementary commentary. So if you have this version of the book and you want to read along, because I do get the comments where people are like, oh, I would like to read along. Could you provide some page numbers? So here we go. This is page 18 and this is the bottom of page 18. Okay, so this is the quote I'm going to read. We have made woman a sex creature, says psychiatrist at the Margaret Sanger Marriage Counselor Clinic. Okay, so the author is interviewing a psychiatrist, which she does a lot in this book. She actually gets a lot of works cited and she does a lot of research and she does some interviews, or a lot of interviews that add a lot of weight to what she's talking about. So she interviews a psychiatrist and she's saying that we have made woman a sex creature. She has no identity except as a wife and mother. She does not know who she is herself. And I continue on page 20. The chains that bind her in her trap are chains in her own mind and spirit. They are chains made up of mistaken ideas and misinterpreted facts, of incomplete truths and unreal choices. They are not easily seen and not easily shaken off. How can any woman see the whole truth within the bounds of her own life? How can she believe that voice inside herself when it denies the conventional, accepted truths by which she has been living? And then I continue to the bottom of the third paragraph here. Questioning them not on their theories, but on their actual experience in treating American women. I became aware of a growing body of evidence, much of which has not been reported publicly because it does not fit current modes of thought about women. Evidence which throws into question the standards of feminine normality, feminine adjustment, feminine fulfillment, and feminine maturity by which most women are still trying to live. If you watch some of my videos, you know that I write notes in the margin. And let me read you my notes so I can start with explaining what I think about this quote. In the margins I wrote, living a false reality, denying truth, is debilitating. And so we have this thing, truth versus reality. Well, what's being said, what I gather from this quote is that in today's world, biological sex plays a huge part on identity. Now, that is a part of identity, but it's a small part, and for many people it's minuscule, and then some people it might be more significant. But in this world, we focus, or in society, that's a huge part of one's identity. And so what happens is that we reject the other aspects of a person's identity. We ignore other parts that make somebody might identify with. It's just all about the biological role in terms of sex. And that's denying a lot of truth. So we have this conflict of truth versus reality. Right. So the reality is biological sex identification. But that doesn't encompass the entire truth of an individual. And this is important. When we talk about feminism, what really makes me feel that feminism is incredibly important is that it highlights this issue of reality versus truth. We're stuck in this reality, which is just a small frame, but it does not encompass the entirety of what's actually going on, what the truth of the matter. So let's continue with my second quote that I picked. So this is page 27, and it is the first paragraph. It is crammed full of food, clothing, cosmetics, furniture, and the physical bodies of young women. But where is the world of thought and ideas, the life of the mind and the spirit? So what Friedan is referring to here is media back in 1963, right? And she's saying here that, in women's magazines were crammed full of, topics of food, clothing, cosmetics, furniture, but they weren't really focusing on thoughts and ideas, right? Issues of the mind and the spirit. And, that was 1963, but let's think about 2019, and let's look at magazines that are targeted and marketed to women. Is that not similar or pretty much the same? It's, again, we are defining what it means to be a person based off of this manufactured biological sex identity. And we're rejecting other aspects of one's identity, like matters of the mind, matters of the spirit. Now we go to the third quote that I picked. This is on page 35, and it is the last sentence of the third paragraph. It will be necessary to break through this wall of mystery and look more closely to those complex concepts, these accepted truths, to understand fully what has happened to American women. The feminine mystique says that the highest value and the only commitment for women is the fulfillment of their own femininity. It says that the great mistake of Western culture through most of its history has been the undervaluation of this femininity. It says this femininity is so mysterious and intuitive and close to the creation and origin of life that man-made science may never be able to understand. And let me read you my notes. The feminine mystique is the constructed false reality which veils truth. Okay, so two things. Again, we're focusing on this idea of truth versus reality. They might not necessarily be the same. And so what has been constructed in society is this idea of femininity, which isn't really the truth behind an individual. It's just this constructed idea that serves a societal purpose. And what happens is that veils the truth behind somebody's true identity, right? Let me tell you a short story. This is interesting. I had this friend, this happened years ago, and we were just hanging out at a restaurant, and he was like, oh, I have this idea. I want to make a website. I'm like, okay, what's the website going to be about? Well, this website's going to be about how to be a man. And I'm like, oh, okay, so what does that mean? Things like tying a tie, right? How many men know how to tie a tie these days? And I'm like, well, does that really matter? Or how does that indicate that you're a man? Well, it's just that's what you're being a man. And then, all types of other things like, being polite, opening the door for a lady, things like that. And I'm thinking like, well, that's just showing, indicating that you're just being nice, or you're just showing that you're being considerate to somebody. It might not necessarily mean that you're, it doesn't prove how masculine you are. These very traditional ideas of masculinity and, showing respect for the ladies. He wanted to make that kind of website, a gentleman's website. Let's think about these ideas and think about where do they truly come from, and how do they actually define identity, and what are really the truth behind these ideas. When we say, for example, tying a tie, in what way does that show our manhood, or being a man? Or is that just something that is constructed in society to, create a reality? This is things that we need to think about as we continue. So, I put that in your head, and we continue. I'm going to continue with quote number 4 that I picked here. So here, the author, Betty Friedan, is interviewing a magazine publisher, right? And she's trying to ask him about, why do you neglect, very complex issues like politics and, issues of religion and, even things of race in your magazines for women? Why do you just focus on like how cooking advice and fashion advice? And the publisher responds, well, women can't take an idea and issue pure. Man who edited the women's magazine agreed. It has to be translated in terms they can understand as women. What's going on here? This is page 45, by the way. And then Friedan continues commenting on that quote. Such a belief, of course, becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Ideas are not like instincts of the blood that spring into the mind intact. They are communicated by education, by the printed word. So what does that mean? Well, what Friedan to say here is that our media constructs ideas that create realities, and she says, that's a very good quote right here. She says, ideas are not like instincts of the blood that spring into the mind intact. They are communicated by education, by the printed word. So media reinforces these ideas of masculinity or femininity, and they enforce these realities as identities for people. And so more and more what happens is that people reject what's true about them, and they just adopt these constructed realities as their identity. And what's important to understand about that is that the rejection of truth, the rejection of what they originally were, to adopt what media tells them that they are. Like my friend who was saying like, oh, I'm going to make this website about how to be a man. And, how do you be a man? Well, you go to that website and you learn, right? But what about all the other things about you? Well, I'll just disregard all that. We're just going to you just go to the media, and that's true for, what Friedan's talk about when she's referring to the women's magazines back in the 1960s. But, even today, you pick up an issue of Elle magazine or Vogue magazine or cosmetology. I don't even know. It's cosmetology, I think, or cosmetology. Well, it's a that magazine with the cosmos. that's the one. That's another women's magazine, and you gotta focus on what are these magazines portraying as femininity, as masculinity. Even male magazines like Esquire or what's that, Playboy, but what's that, like PG-13 Playboy magazine? Well, there's Hustle, which is not PG-13, These ideas are pushed into your minds as identity. And it's not just magazines, right? Which are actually a declining media market. We got television shows, we got the internet, we got websites. Think about how much of this is constructed and how much of this is actually based off of what's true. So let me continue with quote number 5. This is from page 49. It's at the bottom here. There was a new kind of woman's editor or publisher, less interested in ideas to reach women's minds and hearts than in selling them the things that interest advertisers: appliances, detergents, lipstick. Today, the deciding voice on most of these magazines is cast by men. Women often carry out the formulas, but the formulas themselves, which have dictated the new housewife image, are the product of men's minds. So these publishers of women's magazines, right, they're actually, a lot of them are men, right? And they are enforcing these ideas of femininity into the world, into society. Why? And I put on my notes, it's based off of consumerism. It's the driving factor of this false reality, right? As Friedan is talking about. They're less interested in ideas to reach women's minds and hearts than in selling them the things that interest advertisers, like appliances, detergents, lipsticks. They're just trying to sell products. So we'll think about that as we continue. And here on page 50, second to last sentence here. Perhaps the new image of woman did not permit the internal honesty, the depth of perception, and the human truth. And that's exactly what I'm talking about here. This reality that's being constructed, these biological sex roles and these entire identities built off of that. But that doesn't permit the internal honesty, the depth of perception, and the human truth. Rather, they're just things that interest advertisers, right? So let's continue with another quote. And this is page 56. And we're starting on the second to last sentence of this first paragraph here. When a mystique is strong, it makes its own fiction a fact. It feeds on the very facts which might contradict it, and seeps into every corner of the culture, bemusing even the social critics. So again, Friedan is just adding on to that, this idea that using media, magazines, television shows, the internet, they didn't have the internet in 1963, but this media is still being used for that purpose, which is why I'm saying this book is relevant in 2019 as it was in 1963. The media is reiterating this constructed reality, this mystique, this feminine mystique, and it creates this fiction which then people adopt as truth. And the problem with that is that truth is lost. Who somebody really is lost, is rejected, or is pushed aside for the purposes of this adaptation of this biological sex identity. And it is very difficult to ignore that identity or to actually pursue who you truly are, because this constructed reality is seeped everywhere because of media and because of the people who construct that media. So let's talk about this denial of truth in exchange of this constructed reality. Let's talk about that further. And we're going to go to this quote that I picked. This is the 6th quote. This one is on page 62, and it's the 3rd paragraph here. If they are happy, these young women who live the feminine mystique, then is this the end of the road? Or are the seeds of something worse than frustration inherent in this image? Is there a growing divergence between this image of woman and human reality? Let me read you my notes. A false reality is destructive to human truth. So let me read that again, that sentence. Is the growing divergence between this image of woman in human reality. So the image of a lady, the image of a woman, the feminine mystique. That's something right there. Then there's human truth, human reality. That's something else. And there's a divergence between them. I continue on page 64. This is the second paragraph here. Oh, this is the third paragraph. It is not a harmless image, the image of woman. It's not a harmless image. There may be no psychological terms for the harm it is doing, but what happens when women try to live according to an image that makes them deny their minds? What happens when women grow up in an image that makes them deny the reality of the changing world? Then I go to page 65 here. This is the last paragraph. Does the mystique keep American women from growing with the world? Does it force her to deny reality? And not just American women, all women. And not just all women, all people. That's what I'm saying. Here we have page 66, the last paragraph. The feminine mystique is so powerful that women grow up no longer knowing that they have the desires and capacities the mystique forbids. But such a mystique does not fasten itself on a whole nation in a few short years, reversing the trends of a century without cause. What gives the mystique its power? Why did women go home again? And when she's talking about why women went home again, she's talking about the housewife, which was a thing in the 1960s. But, again, this book is focused on white, middle class, suburban women who were housewives and who gave up work for keeping the house. So you gotta remember what its target is. However, if you also just note what she's saying about what the feminine mystique is all about and how it denies people's desires and capacities and what it forbids, let's talk about that. And I put on my notes, how was this false reality constructed and what maintains its power? That's what Friedan is getting at. Okay, we gotta think about, who constructed this feminine mystique? Because it didn't just happen naturally, right? It was created. Who created it and for what purpose? And how is it constantly maintained? Even today in 2019, I keep saying that because, this is a relevant book. Don't get it twisted. Okay, so I'm going to quote number 7 that I chose here. And this is on page 70. This is the second paragraph. The feminine mystique permits, even encourages women to ignore the question of their identity. The mystique says they can answer the question, who am I? By saying, Tom's wife, Mary's mother. But I don't think the mystique would have such power over American women if they did not fear to face this terrifying blank which makes them unable to see themselves after 21. The truth is, and how long it has been true, I'm not sure, but it was true in my generation and it is true of girls growing up today. An American woman no longer has a private image to tell her who she is, or can be, or wants to be. So what Friedan is saying here is that women don't even get a chance of determining their identity because they're just immediately bombarded with media that tells them what they should do and who they should be and how they should look and what should they think. And that's, I would argue that's true for everybody. But what is important about feminism is that feminism points this out. This feminism is so important, I feel, because it's calling out this problem that people don't even have a chance to discover who they truly are because they're just bombarded with this image that they have to adopt to succeed in this constructed society that we've made, or that people in power have made, and we have to conform, or there's social consequences that are negative. Let me read you the notes that I put in the margin here. The false reality is a constructed tool to force individuals to not see their truth beyond society's predefined reality. And I'll just continue with the quote here. We're still at page 70. This is the last paragraph. The public image in the magazines and the television commercials is designed to sell washing machines, cake mixes, deodorants, detergents, rejuvenating face creams, hair tints. But the power of that image, on which companies spend millions of dollars for television time and ad space, and today that's now it's billions of dollars, but in the 60s it was millions, comes from this. American women no longer know who they are. Okay, let me repeat that. The American women no longer know who they are. They are sorely in need of a new image to help them find their identity. As the motivational researchers keep telling the advertisers, American women are so unsure of who they should be that they look to this glossy public image to decide every detail of their lives. They look for the image they will no longer take from their mothers. And I just put in the margins here for my notes, a consumerist capitalist culture fuels the false reality. The purpose is advertisers trying to sell products, and it's the engine, the fuel that powers this false construct of what it means to be feminine, what it means to be masculine, or human identity overall is constructed. And you go out and you buy the products that will make you a woman, that will make you a man. And in this hot pursuit of false reality, we lose who we truly are. Again, this is important because it's a denial of truth. And isn't that what philosophy is all about? The pursuit of truth, right? And when we as philosophers, or in the field of philosophy, when we notice truth being denied, that's when we need to step up. And that's when the field needs to step up. And this is what feminism is talking about. Now, this is the 8th quote I picked. This is on page 77, and I'm continuing here from the 2nd paragraph. It is my thesis, Betty Friedan's thesis, that the core of the problem for women today is not sexual, but a problem of identity, a stunting or evasion of growth that is perpetuated by the feminine mystique. It is my thesis that as the Victorian culture did not permit women to accept or gratify their basic needs, our culture does not permit women to accept or gratify their basic need to grow and fulfill their potentialities as human beings, a need which is not solely defined by their sexual role. Let me read you my notes to help me understand this quote. My note says, society forces identity to be defined by biological sex, which is not necessarily aligned with truth. So let me continue. This is the 3rd paragraph here on page 77. The expectations of feminine fulfillment that are fed to women by magazines, televisions, movies, and books that popularize psychological half-truths, and by parents, teachers, and counselors who accept the feminine mystique, operate as a kind of youth serum, keeping most women in a state of sexual larvae, preventing them from achieving the maturity of which they are capable. And there is increasing evidence that woman's failure to grow to complete identity has hampered rather than enriched her sexual fulfillment. So what Friedan's saying here is that this false reality, this feminine mystique, has forced women to not grow in a way that they could fully realize their identity. They are unable to discover the truth behind who they really are, the truth of themselves. So in the way, it's kind of a psychological immaturity that this feminine mystique has enforced onto women. But, and then I would add my 2 cents that this is the case for women and men, which actually Friedan does highlight as well in this book. But again, I just want to talk about how this is true today, and it's true not just for women, it's true for men. So what I'm saying here is that feminism has universal benefit, because again, what we're talking about is a denial of truth and who we really are in our true identities, and we accept this falsehood, this false reality. And it has very adverse effects. So here we are at page 80. This is the 9th quote that I've chosen that we'll discuss. And this is the 2nd sentence here. Anatomy is women's destiny, say the theorists of femininity. The identity of woman is determined by her biology. But is it? More and more women are asking themselves this question. As if they were waking from a coma, they ask, where am I? What am I doing here? For the first time in their history, women are becoming aware of an identity crisis in their own lives. And I think this is what feminism is. It's this question of, okay, where am I? What am I doing here? Or, what is this system that's telling me that I'm supposed to be this, this, and this, and this? And that's not really who I am. I'm this other person. And so why am I doing this? This is what feminism is. And, I would argue that's what philosophy is. Now I take you to the last paragraph of page 80. I think this is the crisis of women growing up, a turning point from an immaturity that has been called femininity to full human identity. Let me repeat that. That's really good. An immaturity that has been called femininity to full human identity. I think women had to suffer this crisis of identity and have to suffer it still today simply to become fully human. Now, what we're not talking, let's talk about like the femininity, right? Femininity is, it's a true, there's truth behind femininity and masculinity, but what Friedan is talking about is this constructed false idea of femininity, right? This toxic masculinity, this subordinate femininity, this unreal construct of what femininity is. That's what Friedan is talking about. It's a perverse constructed reality that serves a purpose to benefit some people to maintain a certain kind of power structure, but it's hurting a lot of people, and it's hurting them because women and men suffer this crisis of identity. And I wrote in my notes here, the realization that identity is beyond anatomy, beyond social constructs. True identity exists outside reality. What does that mean? Outside reality. And again, I just want to say truth versus reality. You have a little box reality that may be real and may not be real. It's constructed. But then there's truth, which, goes all over the place. And, people exist outside that little frame, reality frame, which is masculinity, femininity, right? This binary, biological, social, sex identity construct. Real people, like the truth of identity exists outside of that frame. And for people to realize their true identity, they have to suffer because society forces people to live inside that frame. And if you don't fit inside that frame and try and go outside that frame, there's some negative social consequences that result in that. So here we are on page 81, and this is the last sentence of the 2nd paragraph. Very nature as women, which fulfills itself only through sexual passivity, acceptance of male domination, and nurturing motherhood. And here Friedan is talking about social definition of femininity, and that's what I was talking about, this constructed idea of femininity, this false reality that is the feminine mystique. It's not so much an attack on femininity, it's an attack on this feminine mystique, this social construct that isn't true. I'll take you to the 10th quote that I picked, and it is on page 113. Here we are at the third paragraph here. This is the second sentence. It is not a slogan, but a fundamental statement about truth to say that no social scientist can completely free himself from the prison of his own culture. He can only interpret what he observes in the scientific framework of his own time. This is true even of the great innovators. They cannot help but translate their revolutionary observations into language and rubrics that have been determined by the progress of science up until their time. Even those discoveries that create new rubrics are relative to the vantage point of their creator. The knowledge of other cultures, the understanding of cultural relativity, which is part of the framework of social scientists in our own time, was unknown to Freud. So Friedan is bringing up Sigmund Freud, which, he was the guy, very popular, right? He's the guy that developed the Oedipus complex, penis envy, all these bogus ideas of psychology that are still infused in society today, right? And he's considered a genius for that. Very few of his ideas are very good. Many of his ideas are very wacky. However, society, based off of the media and our literature, have those ideas still ingrained in what defines us as people, which is not truly what defines us as people, or not truly who we really are. And Friedan talks about how Sigmund Freud was just limited to his small world. And even though he was this, psychological genius, the psychiatrist is great, he is considered the father of psychiatry, he still was limited in what he did. And for example, his patients, they were a certain class, a certain condition, a certain situation. He didn't interview or get his information from people of other ethnicities, of other nations, of other, even religions. He got his information from a specific, certain type of person, and that limits the information you're gonna get. And it doesn't matter how smart or how intelligent you are. What Friedan is saying here is that the understanding of cultural relativity, American culture versus European culture versus Mexican culture, versus black culture versus Asian culture, which is Asian culture, all these various different Asian nations and ethnicities, and there's all these kinds of social conditions that we need to consider, and they're very valuable. And these identities are what is truth. And when we try to put truth in a box, and we say like, oh, these experts have created these identities that are true, we create this falsehood that limits people, and it excludes certain kinds of people and certain kinds of cultures, and that makes the human species in general suffer. So let me continue on page 114 here. This is the last sentence of the first paragraph. Much of what Freud described as a characteristic of universal human nature was merely characteristic of certain middle-class European men and women at the end of the 19th century. That's what I was saying, and I just want to reiterate it with what Friedan says herself. So any type of characteristic outside certain middle-class European men and women was completely disregarded. And now we have these entire psychological and psychiatric theories that are applied to everybody. Like, if you're outside that, you're like, oh, okay, there's something wrong with you. No, you just are not considering characteristics outside of certain middle-class European men and women at the end of the 19th century. Okay, there's a lot more truth beyond that. So let me read you the 11th quote that I picked. This is on page 147. This is in the middle of the second paragraph here. To limit one's field of inquiry to the function of an institution in a given social system with no alternatives considered, provides an infinite number of rationalizations for all the inequalities and inequities of that system. And this is the beginning of the third paragraph. A social order can function only because the vast majority have somehow adjusted themselves to their place in society and perform the functions expected of them. The differences in the upbringing of the sexes are obviously related to their respective roles in adult life. So what Friedan is saying here is that when certain truths are ignored and when people fit outside the little small frame that's the constructed reality that isn't necessarily aligned with truth, this feminine mystique, people, experts will create all types of excuses and create all types of theories and bogus science, basically, that excuses or explains why these truths aren't exist. Oh, this person doesn't fit this traditional idea of femininity because of this psychological theory or this social construct or this educational notion. Right? There's all these excuses can be created once we adopt this false reality as true. It's very easy to reject truth at the service of a false reality. Now let me read you the 12th quote that I picked. There's a lot of quotes. This book is chock full of excellent quotes. This is on page 161. And we begin on the second paragraph here. This glorification of the female sexual function, the vision of the mystique, was of a world where women, by merely being women and bearing children, will earn the same respect accorded men for their creative achievements, as if possession of uterus and breasts bestows on women a glory that men can never know, even though they labor all their lives to create. In such a world, all the other things that a woman can do or be are merely pale substitutes for the conception of a child. Femininity becomes more than its definition by society. It becomes a value which society must protect from the destructive onrush of civilization. And here, Friedan is explaining what the feminine mystique is. It is an inflated, overvalued, false identity. The ability to have a child, the ability to subordinate to a man, right? That is this constructed feminine mystique. And it is then not even an identity anymore. It is a value. It's like, okay, how good can you do that? How well can you create a baby? How well can you subordinate to a man? That's what femininity is. And it becomes like a gauge, a scale. So not only is it a false reality that is taken as an identity, and then a rejection of truth happens, but then that false reality becomes a gauge or some sort of scale that determines how valuable a person is. So there's all types of corruption that happens, and all types of rejection of truth, and the way we value somebody becomes a valuation of how false they are, or how much do they deny the truth of themselves. That's how valuable they become. It's really messed up. The 13th quote I picked is on page 165. This is the last paragraph. We may go up the scale from simple physical differences through complementary distinctions that overstress the role of sex difference and extend it inappropriately to other aspects of life, to stereotypes of such complex activities as those involved in the formal use of the intellect, in the arts, in government, and in religion. There has been this tendency to make artificial definitions that limit an activity to one's sex, and by denying the actual potentialities of human beings, limit not only both men and women, but also equally the development of the activity itself. Men's overestimation of women's roles and women's overestimation of men's roles leads one sex or the other to arrogate, to neglect, or even to relinquish part of our so dearly won humanity. Those who would break the circle are themselves a product of it, express some of its defects in their every gesture, may be only strong enough to challenge it, not able actually to break it. Yet once identified, once analyzed, it should be possible to create a climate of opinion in which others, a little less the product of the dark past because they have been reared with a light in their hand that can shine backwards as well as forwards, may in turn take the next step. And I put in my notes, those who expose the falseness of the feminine mystique, reality, are socially punished. And that's what's being said there. And I continue on the last paragraph of 167. It was perhaps not her fault that she was taken so literally that procreation became a cult, a career, to the exclusion of every other kind of creative endeavor, until women kept on having babies because they knew no other way to create. Right? And that's I mean, to be honest, that's very accurate. You know, baby making has become somewhat of a cult these days, right? And this is 1963. Is it the same in 2019? Yeah, I would say so. You know, the gauge of the value of a woman socially is still, have you had a baby yet? Right? And it's like a cult. It's like a career. You know, it was a career housewife. It still is in many situations. And it excludes every other kind of creative endeavor. What about other ways to create? Are we even going to consider that? And Friedan is saying, like, oh, that's the problem. We're not even considering a human being's other aspects of creativity. We're just considering this little, small aspect of human identity. You know, and it's an important aspect, don't get me wrong, but, you know, considering what a human is capable of doing, it is a relatively small fraction. But this false reality, this feminine mystique, it does serve a purpose. And we already touched on it. Commercial, capital, capitalistic. This is quote number 14 I picked. This is on page 212. A mystique does not compel its own acceptance. For the feminine mystique to have brainwashed American women of non-sexual human purposes for more than 15 years, it must have filled real needs. And she's saying more than 15 years. I mean, it's a lot longer than that. But I shall continue. In those who seized on it for others and those who accepted it for themselves. Those needs may not have been the same in all the women or in all the purveyors of the mystique. But there were many needs at this particular time in America that made us pushovers for the mystique. Needs so compelling that we suspended critical thought as one does in the face of intuitive truth. The trouble is, when need is strong enough, intuition can also lie. Okay, suspending critical thought for intuitive truth. And then she says the trouble is, when the need is strong enough, intuition can also lie. And what is this need? Well, the need to control social economic power. That's what I'm saying. A social economic maintenance. Let me go to the 15th quote I picked. And so the American woman made her mistaken choice. She ran back home again to live by sex alone, trading in her individuality for security. Powerful foes in this nation must be served by those pretty domestic pictures that stare at us everywhere, forbidding a woman to use her own abilities in the world. The preservation of the feminine mystique, in this sense, could have implications that are not sexual at all. When one begins to think about it, America depends rather heavily on women's passive dependence, their femininity. Femininity, if one still wants to call it that, makes American women a target and a victim of the sexual cell. And this is on page 241. So what is this sexual cell that Friedan is talking about? Well, I continue on page 243. This is the third sentence. Why is it never said that the really crucial function the really important role that women serve as housewives is to buy more things for the house. In all the talk of femininity and women's role, one forgets that the real business of America is business. But the perpetuation of housewifery, the growth of the feminine mystique, makes sense and dollars when one realizes that women are the chief customers of American business. Somehow, somewhere, someone must have figured out that women will buy more things if they are kept in the underused, nameless yearning energy to get rid of state of being housewives. A thinking vice president says, too many women getting educated don't want to stay home. Unhealthy. If they all get to be scientists and such, they won't have time to shop. But how can we keep them home? They want careers now. We'll liberate them to have careers at home. It was not an economic conspiracy directed against women. It was a byproduct of our general confusion of means with ends. Just something that happened to women when the business of producing and selling and investing in business for profit, which is merely the way our economy is organized to serve men's needs efficiently, began to be confused with the purpose of our nation, the end of life itself. No more surprising the subversion of women's lives in America to the ends of business than the subversion of the sciences of human behavior to the business of deluding women about their real needs. It would take a clever economist to figure out what would keep our affluent economy going if the housewife market began to fall off, just as the economists would have to figure out what to do if there were no threat of war. So in the end, and when you really think about it, it's quite obvious. The feminine mystique is motivated by capitalism, and consumerism, and making sure big businesses stay big and in business. I will continue on page 246. This is the last paragraph. The second type, the career woman, or would-be career woman, was a minority, but an extremely unhealthy one from the seller's standpoint. Advertisers were warned that it would be to their advantage not to let this group get any larger, for such women, though not necessarily job holders, do not believe that a woman's place is primarily in the home. The point to bear in mind regarding career women, the study said, and this is a study that was done by big businesses, is that while they buy modern appliances, they are not the ideal type of customer. They are too critical. They're too critical to be customers. Critical thought is a disadvantage toward consumerism. So, and then to further reiterate the point of denial of truth in acceptance of some sort of false construct, a false reality, that is an advantage toward consumerism, right? When people do that, they're more willing to buy into these products that these people are selling. Let me read you this 17th quote I picked from page 322. Women who have no identity other than sex creatures must ultimately seek their reassurance through the possession of things. One suddenly sees why manipulators cater to sexual hunger in their attempt to sell products which are not even remotely sexual. As long as women's needs for achievement and identity can be channeled into this search for sexual status, she is easy prey for any product which presumably promises her that status. A status that cannot be achieved by effort or achievement of her own. And since that endless search for status as a desirable sexual object is seldom satisfied in reality for most American housewives, who at best can only try to look like Elizabeth Taylor, it is very easily translated into a search for status through the possession of objects. And I put in my notes, the feminine mystique used as a tool of consumerism. So let me go to the 18th quote I picked here. It's from page 380. We are living through a period in which a great many of the higher human needs are reduced to or are seen as symbolic workings out of the sexual need. But the sexual symbol is easier to see than sex itself as a symbol. If women's needs for identity, for self-esteem, for achievement, and finally for expression of her unique human individuality are not recognized by herself or others in our culture, she is forced to seek identity and self-esteem in the only channels open to her: the pursuit of sexual fulfillment, motherhood, and the possession of material things. And chained to these pursuits, she is stunted at a lower level of living, blocked from the realization of her higher human needs. I notate, identity confined only within a sexual social framework is false. We're just going to keep on reiterating this point. 19th quote I picked on page 416. The only way for a woman, as for a man, to find herself, to know herself as a person, is by creative work of her own. There is no other way. But a job, any job, is not the answer. In fact, it can be part of the trap. Women who do not look for jobs equal to their actual capacity, who do not let themselves develop the lifetime interests and goals which require serious education and training, are walking almost as surely as the ones who stay inside the housewife trap, to a non-existent future. If a job is to be the way out of the trap for a woman, it must be a job that she can take seriously as part of a life plan, work in which she can grow as part of society. I notate, a career where one can use one's passion/interest to make society better. That's what truth is. Not to conform to some social construct that isn't who you really are. This is the 20th quote I picked on the end of page 451. If an able American woman does not use her human energy and ability in some meaningful pursuit, which necessarily means competition, for there is competition in every serious pursuit of our society, she will fritter away her energy in neurotic symptoms or unproductive exercise or destructive love. So not pursuing meaning in life is destructive. And isn't that what philosophy is all about? We're pursuing meaning, truth. And when you can't do that, it denies humanity. That's the whole point of philosophy, isn't it? That's why I argue that feminism is a philosophy and is a valid one, and is actually a very important one. Only by experiencing truth can we derive meaning as human beings. I continue now on page 454. This is the last sentence of the first paragraph. They knew that marriage and motherhood are an essential part of life, but not the whole of it. These mutations suffered and surmounted the cultural discontinuity in role conditioning, the role crisis, and the identity crisis. They did not retreat into privatism, but met the challenges of the real world. And they knew quite surely now who they are. And Friedan's talking about feminists. Here, we're on page 455. They were doing, perhaps without seeing it clearly, what every man and woman must do now to keep up with the increasingly explosive pace of history and find or keep individual identity in our mass society. The identity crisis in men and women cannot be solved by one generation for the next. In our rapidly changing society, it must be faced continually, solved only to be faced again in the span of a single lifetime. A life plan must be open to change as new possibilities open in society and in oneself. No woman in America today who starts her search for identity can be sure where it will take her. No woman starts that search today without struggle, conflict, and taking her courage in her hands. But the women I met who were moving on that unknown road did not regret the pains, the efforts, the risks. So what Friedan's referring to here is this predefined notion of what femininity is or what it means to be a woman, right? Who knows what that is? We don't know yet. We have to search for our identity, and that's not predefined, right? We have to look for it, and it's a pursuit and it's a struggle, and there's going to be hardships involved. But it's not predefined, and it's not this constructed reality that we see today. And by going through the hardship of discovering the truth of our reality, that gives us meaning, and that gives us purpose. That's constructive. Here we are on page 456, the first paragraph here at the end. And when women do not need to live through their husbands and children, men will not fear the love and strength of women, nor need another's weakness to prove their own masculinity. They can finally see each other as they are, and this may be the next step in human evolution. Who knows of the possibilities of love when men and women share not only the fulfillment of their biological roles, but the responsibilities and passions of the work that creates the human future and the full human knowledge of who they are. The philosophical pursuit, when men and women are able to share the philosophical pursuit, this is what Friedan is saying. That is the next step of human evolution. Isn't that very powerful? I mean, that is a deeply philosophical quote. It's true. Okay, here's the last quote I'll read you. This is on page 465. I couldn't define liberation for women in terms that denied the sexual and human reality of our need to love and even sometimes to depend upon a man. What had to be changed was the obsolete feminine and masculine sex roles that dehumanize sex, making it almost impossible for women and men to make love, not war. How could we ever really know or love each other as long as we played those roles that kept us from knowing or being ourselves? Weren't men as well as women still locked in lonely isolation, alienation, no matter how many sexual aerobatics they put their bodies through? Weren't men dying too young, suppressing fears and tears in their own tenderness? It seemed to me that men weren't really the enemy. They were fellow victims, suffering from an outmoded masculine mystique that made them feel unnecessarily inadequate when they were no bears to kill. And again, what Friedan is mentioning here is the universality of what she's saying. It doesn't just apply to women, it applies to men too. It applies to human beings. Right? When we adopt these false realities that are destroying us because they're denying the truth of who we are, we can't reach the next level of human potential. We're restricted because we just keep conforming to these false constructs, this feminine mystique. I encourage you to read this book, The Feminine Mystique. It's a very powerful book. And you know, I spent a lot of time reading quotes, and I didn't read half the quotes that I highlighted here. There's so much more to this book, and is it relevant to today? Absolutely. You know, and that's, in a way, that's sad to say, because we're still dealing with a lot of these same problems. You know, it's not a perfect book. Again, you know, it doesn't address issues of race, which are very important. It doesn't address issues of queer identity, gay, lesbian, bisexual identity, transgender identity. It doesn't talk about that. It is limited in that way, for sure. But still, The Feminine Mystique has a lot of useful information that we can utilize to create a lot of positive change. You know, I do think that. This is not just a history lesson like, oh, I wonder what feminism was back in the 1960s. No. When you read this, you will know problems that still persist to this day. You know, very profound, important problems that we still need to solve. And actually, this book has a solution. Really, has several solutions for specific kinds of problems that we deal with in terms of false identity, social problems of gender conformity, and you know, the flaws of capitalism and consumerism. I think this book is a great example of why feminism is relevant, why it's important, why it has a lot of answers to today's social problems, and why it is a legit philosophy and a very important philosophy. So I encourage you to check it out, The Feminine Mystique by Betty Friedan. Well, you've been watching The Black Ponder. Tune in next time for more philosophical thought.